You know that crushing moment when you realize the child you sacrificed everything for sees you as nothing more than an embarrassment? When the person you brought into this world, nurtured through every scraped knee and broken heart, suddenly decides you're not good enough for their new life? When 30 years of unconditional love gets dismissed with a casual phone call because you don't fit their perfect picture anymore? Well, let me tell you about the day I discovered that sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones we'd move mountains for, and how that discovery changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The California sun was particularly harsh that Tuesday morning, streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my riverside home with an intensity that felt almost accusatory. I stood in my kitchen, still in my silk pajamas at 11 a.m., something I never would have allowed myself when Richard was alive. But 8 months of widowhood had taught me that some rules simply didn't matter anymore. The granite countertops gleamed under the morning light, reflecting the organized chaos of wedding planning materials I'd spread across every available surface the night before. Fabric samples, venue photographs, catering menus, and florist portfolios created a rainbow of possibilities that should have filled me with joy. Instead, they felt like evidence of my son Kevin's growing distance, each decision made without my input despite my generous offer to fund the entire celebration. At 62, I'd learned to read between the lines, and the lines Kevin had been drawing lately spelled out a message I wasn't ready to accept. My name is Margaret Thompson, though everyone calls me Maggie, and until 8 months ago, I thought I had it all figured out. 35 years of marriage to Richard had taught me that love was about building something together, brick by brick, compromise by compromise. We'd started Thompson & Associates real estate development with nothing but a borrowed pickup truck and an old contractor's license Richard had earned in his 20s. By the time cancer took him last winter, we'd built a company worth $8 million and employed 43 people across Southern California. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd spent decades helping other families build their dream homes while watching my own family slowly drift apart. Kevin had always been ambitious, driven by a restless energy that reminded me so much of his father in the early days. But where Richard's ambition had been tempered by loyalty and genuine care for others, Kevin's seemed focused solely on image and advancement. At 29, he was already a successful investment banker in Los Angeles, dating Ashley Rodriguez, a 26-year-old marketing executive whose Instagram posts looked like magazine spreads. I'd been thrilled when they announced their engagement 6 months ago. After Richard's death, the thought of new beginnings, of watching my son start his own family, had been the first thing to penetrate the fog of grief that had settled over my life. I'd immediately offered to pay for the wedding, secretly hoping it would give us a chance to reconnect, to bridge the gap that had been widening since he'd moved to LA 5 years earlier. The morning light shifted, casting long shadows across the wedding planning materials, and I found myself thinking about how different Kevin had become since college. The boy who used to call me every Sunday without fail now went weeks without contact. The son who once brought girlfriends home for family dinners now seemed to view our suburban riverside home as somehow beneath him. I'd attributed it to normal, growing pains, the natural evolution of a young man finding his place in the world. But lately, I'd begun to wonder if there was something more deliberate in his distance. My phone buzzed against the marble counter, breaking through my melancholy thoughts. Kevin's name flashed on the screen, and despite everything, my heart still did that little skip it had done since he was born. Even at 29, he was still my baby, my firstborn, the child who'd made me a mother and changed everything about who I thought I could be. "Good morning, sweetheart," I answered, automatically moving to the coffee maker to pour myself a fresh cup. I was just looking at some venue options Patricia sent over. The Silverado Resort in Napa looks absolutely stunning, and they have availability for your date in September. There was a pause on the other end, the kind of silence that immediately puts a mother on alert. Kevin's voice, when it came, carried that carefully controlled tone he'd perfected in his banking career, the one that meant he was about to deliver news he knew I wouldn't like. "Mom, Ashley and I need to talk to you about something." Another pause. "About the wedding." I set my coffee cup down carefully, suddenly aware of how quiet the house was around me. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked steadily. The same clock Richard and I had bought for our first anniversary, back when we could barely afford the monthly payments. Now it felt like it was counting down to something I wasn't prepared for. "Of course, honey. What's on your mind?" "Well, we've been thinking about the guest list, and we're trying to keep things really intimate. You know, just the most important people in our lives." The careful phrasing should have been my first warning, but I was still operating under the assumption that I fell firmly into the category of most important people. How naive that seems now, looking back. "That sounds lovely," I said, already mentally calculating how a smaller guest list might affect the catering budget. Intimate weddings can be so much more meaningful. How many people are we talking about? "About 50, Kevin said quickly. "Maybe 60. Ashley's family is pretty small, and we want to keep the focus on our closest friends and the people who are really part of our daily lives now." Something cold began to settle in my stomach, though I couldn't yet put my finger on why. "That sounds perfect. I'm sure whatever you decide will be beautiful." "The thing is, Mom," Kevin continued, and now I could hear Ashley's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. "We've been talking about this a lot, and we think maybe it would be better if you didn't come to the ceremony." The words hit me like a physical blow. I actually took a step backward, bumping into the kitchen island, sending several fabric samples floating to the floor. "I'm sorry, what?" "It's not personal," Kevin said quickly, though the very fact that he felt the need to say that made it deeply personal. "It's just that Ashley's family is very young and modern, and we want the whole event to feel fresh and contemporary. We're going for a very specific vibe, and honestly, having older relatives there might change the dynamic we're trying to create." I stood there in my kitchen, surrounded by wedding materials I'd been excitedly organizing just moments before, trying to process what my son had just said to me. Older relatives. At 62, I was apparently too old to witness my own son's wedding. "Kevin," I said slowly, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "I'm your mother." "I know, and we love you," he said, though the words felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced this conversation. "That's why we want to do something special, just the three of us. Maybe dinner the week before, or a nice brunch after they get back." From their honeymoon. Something more personal and meaningful than just being lost in a crowd at a big party. The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. A big party. He was describing his own wedding as a big party that I would somehow diminish by attending. I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white against the dark granite. "You don't want me at your wedding because I'm too old?" "It's not about age exactly," Kevin backpedaled, though we both knew that's exactly what it was about. "It's about the aesthetic we're going for. All of Ashley's friends are in their 20s and early 30s. Her parents are only in their late 40s. We want the photos to look cohesive, and we want our guests to feel like they're part of the same generation, the same world." I thought about all the times I'd watched other mothers struggle with difficult adult children and secretly judged them for not maintaining better relationships. I'd been so proud of how close Kevin and I were, how respectful and loving he'd always been. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The smugness of that pride now felt like acid in my throat. "Kevin, I'm paying for this wedding." Another pause, longer this time. "We know, and we're grateful. Really grateful. That's why we want to make sure you're comfortable with everything. We don't want you to feel obligated to attend just because you're helping financially. We want you to know that your contribution is appreciated regardless." The manipulation was so smooth so perfectly constructed that I almost admired it. He'd managed to reframe my exclusion as consideration for my feelings, my financial contribution, as optional generosity rather than the maternal gift I'd intended it to be. "Let me see if I understand this correctly," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "You want me to pay for a wedding I'm not invited to attend because my presence would ruin the aesthetic you're trying to achieve." "Mom, please don't." "Make this harder than it has to be," Kevin said. And for the first time, I heard a note of genuine emotion in his voice. But it wasn't remorse or love. It was irritation. "We've thought about this a lot, and it's what's best for everyone." "What's best for everyone?" The phrase echoed in my mind as I stared out at the perfectly manicured backyard Richard and I had designed together, the space where we'd hosted Kevin's high school graduation party, his college send-off, countless birthday celebrations, and family gatherings. How many times had we sacrificed what was best for us in favor of what was best for everyone, meaning what was best for our children? "I need to think about this," I said finally. "Of course," Kevin replied, relief evident in his voice. "Take all the time you need, and Mom, we really do love you. This isn't about that." After he hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long time, surrounded by wedding plans for a celebration I was no longer welcome to attend. The California sun continued to stream through the windows, but it no longer felt warm. Instead, it illuminated every corner of a house that suddenly felt far too large and quiet, every surface that held memories of a family that apparently no longer existed in the way I'd believed it did. I picked up one of the fabric samples from the floor, a soft champagne silk that would have looked beautiful in photographs. The kind of photographs I would never see, of a day I would never witness, celebrating a love I was apparently too old and aesthetically inappropriate to share. That's when I began to understand that this wasn't really about a wedding at all. This was about who Kevin had become and who he believed I was in his new life. This was about value and worth, and the quiet cruelty that can exist between people who are supposed to love each other unconditionally. I walked to Richard's study, a room I'd barely entered since his death, and sat down at his mahogany desk. The walls were lined with photos from our company's projects over the years, families standing in front of homes we'd helped them build, dreams made concrete and real. Richard had believed that what we built together mattered, that it would last, that it would mean something to the people who came after us. Looking at those photos now, I realized that I'd been living in the past, holding on to an image of my family that no longer reflected reality. Kevin didn't see me as his mother, his partner in building something meaningful. He saw me as an inconvenience, an embarrassment, an obstacle to the sophisticated image he was trying to construct. The realization should have broken me. 8 months earlier, it would have. But something had changed in me during those long months of grief, something I was only beginning to recognize. Richard's death had stripped away many of my illusions about permanence and security, but it had also revealed reserves of strength I hadn't known I possessed. I opened Richard's desk drawer and pulled out our family's financial portfolio, documents I'd been avoiding since his death, but that I knew I'd eventually need to face. Thompson and Associates, the company we'd built together, was worth more than Kevin probably realized. Our real estate investments, carefully accumulated over decades, represented a legacy that would set our children up for life. A legacy I'd assumed would pass naturally and lovingly to Kevin and his sister Rachel. Rewards for being our children, for carrying forward the Thompson name and values. But as I sat there in Richard's chair, holding papers that represented 35 years of hard work and sacrifice, I began to wonder whether Kevin had earned the right to that legacy. Whether someone who saw his own mother as too old and embarrassing to include in his wedding deserved to inherit the fruits of her labor. The afternoon stretched ahead of me, empty, and possibilities I'd never considered before. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt something other than grief. I felt curious about what came next, about what choices I still had to make, about what kind of woman I wanted to be in this new chapter of my life. I'd spent 62 years being someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's mother. Maybe it was time to figure out who Margaret Thompson was when she was just herself. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that only comes after a sleepless night of hard realizations. I'd spent hours walking through my house, really, seeing it for the first time in months. The Spanish-style architecture Richard and I had fallen in love with 30 years ago. The hand-selected tiles we'd imported from Mexico. The custom ironwork that had taken artisans 6 months to complete. Every detail had been chosen with care, with the expectation that this would be our forever home, the place where our children would bring grandchildren for holidays and summer visits. Now it felt like a museum to assumptions I'd made about my life, about my family, about my place in Kevin's world. I made coffee in the state-of-the-art kitchen I'd redesigned just 3 years ago, back when I thought Kevin and Ashley might want to host Thanksgiving here someday. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd created a space perfect for entertaining the very people who now considered me too aesthetically unpleasing to include in their celebrations. By 10 a.m., I'd made a decision that would have shocked the Margaret Thompson of just 48 hours ago. I was going to visit Patricia Williams, our family attorney and one of my oldest friends. If Kevin wanted to treat me like a business transaction, paying for services I wouldn't be allowed to enjoy, then perhaps it was time I started thinking like a businesswoman instead of just a mother. Patricia's office occupied the top floor of a sleek glass building in downtown Riverside, a far cry from the cramped storefront where she'd started her practice 25 years ago. I'd watched her build her law firm from nothing, just like Richard and I had built Thompson & Associates. Through determination and careful choices, she'd never married, never had children, and I'd sometimes pitied her for that. Now I wondered if she'd been the wiser one, investing her emotional energy in relationships that couldn't break her heart through casual cruelty. The elevator ride to the 15th floor gave me time to rehearse what I wanted to say, though I knew Patricia would see through any pretense immediately. We'd known each other too long, shared too much history. She'd been the one to hold my hand through Richard's final weeks, the one who'd helped me navigate the legal complexities of his death, the one who'd insisted I take time to grieve before making any major decisions about the company or my future. Patricia's assistant, a young woman with perfectly styled hair and a smile that looked genuine, showed me into the familiar corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Patricia looked up from her computer, her silver hair catching the morning light, and I saw my own surprise reflected in her expression. I rarely visited without calling ahead, and I never came looking like I had something important to discuss. "Maggie," she said, standing to embrace me. "This is unexpected. You look like a woman on a mission." I settled into one of the leather chairs across from her desk, the same chairs where Richard and I had signed our wills, where we'd celebrated major business deals, where we'd planned for a future that had been cut short by cancer. "I need to talk to you about Kevin's inheritance." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly, but she didn't look shocked. After 25 years of practicing family law, very little surprised her anymore. "Has something happened?" I told her everything, from Kevin's phone call to my growing awareness of how he'd been treating me since Richard's death. Patricia listened without interruption, her face carefully neutral, though I caught glimpses of the anger she was working to contain. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the cityscape below. "How much are you paying for this wedding?" she asked finally. $150,000. The venue alone is $60,000. Patricia's jaw tightened. "And he doesn't want you there because you'll ruin the aesthetic." "According to him, yes." She turned back to me, and I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before when we discussed my children. Disgust. Pure, undisguised disgust. "Maggie, in 25 years of practice, I've seen a lot of family dysfunction. I've seen children contest wills, fight over inheritances, abandon elderly parents. But I've never seen anything quite this coldly calculated. Her words validated something I'd been afraid to acknowledge. This wasn't just a thoughtless mistake or a moment of poor judgment. This was deliberate, planned cruelty designed to put me in my place while extracting maximum financial benefit. "What are my options?" I asked. Patricia opened a file cabinet and withdrew a thick folder I recognized as our family's estate planning documents. "Well, let's start with what Kevin stands to inherit. Between your share of Thompson and Associates, the real estate investments, and your personal assets, we're looking at approximately $2 million that would be split between Kevin and Rachel." The number hung in the air between us. Richard and I had worked so hard for so long that the wealth had accumulated almost without our notice, each successful project building on the last. We'd lived comfortably but not extravagantly, always thinking about leaving something meaningful for our children. "And I can change that?" "You can change whatever you want. It's your money, Maggie. The question is what you want to achieve." I thought about Kevin's voice on the phone, the casual dismissal, the way he'd made my exclusion sound like a favor he was doing me. I thought about all the times I'd made excuses for his behavior, all the ways I'd adapted my expectations to accommodate his increasingly distant attitude. "I want him to understand that actions have consequences," I said slowly. "I want him to know that treating people badly, especially family, costs something real." Patricia nodded approvingly. "We can definitely accomplish that. The question is how dramatic you want to be." We spent the next 2 hours going through various scenarios. I could reduce his inheritance, eliminate it entirely, or create conditions he'd have to meet to receive it. Each option had legal implications and emotional consequences I'd need to consider carefully. "There's something else you should know," Patricia said as we wrapped up our initial discussion. "About 3 months ago, Kevin called me directly. He wanted to know about the timeline for settling Richard's estate and when he could expect to receive his inheritance." Another piece clicked into place. Kevin's sudden interest in planning an expensive wedding, his willingness to accept my financial contribution while excluding me from the event, his assumption that I'd simply go along with whatever arrangement he proposed. He'd been counting on that inheritance money. "Did you tell him anything?" "I told him he'd need to discuss it with you. But Maggie, the way he asked the questions, the assumptions he made about timelines and amounts, it was clear he'd been thinking about this money as his for some time." I drove home through the familiar streets of Riverside, past the neighborhoods where Thompson and Associates had built dozens of homes over the years. Each development represented not just business, success, but relationships built with families. Dreams realized through careful planning and hard work. Richard had always said that real estate was really about hope, about people's belief that they could build something better for themselves and their children. What had we built for Kevin? What lessons had we taught him about family, about loyalty, about treating people with respect? Somewhere along the way, our success had become his expectation. Our love had become his entitlement. Our presence had become his inconvenience. Back at home, I found myself in Richard's study again, this time pulling out photo albums I hadn't looked at in years. Kevin as a baby, chubby and smiling, reaching for the camera with tiny hands. Kevin as a toddler, helping Richard plant trees. In our backyard, more interested in playing in the dirt than actual gardening. Kevin at 10, proudly showing off the treehouse Richard had built for him, the same treehouse that still stood in our oak tree, weathered but sturdy. When had that joyful child become the calculating man who could exclude his mother from his wedding with such casual cruelty? When had our relationship become something he could manipulate for maximum financial benefit while minimizing personal inconvenience? My phone rang, and Rachel's name appeared on the screen. My daughter, living her quiet life in Phoenix with her husband and 2 young children, had always been different from Kevin. Less ambitious, perhaps, but also more genuine. More connected to family values that seemed to matter less and less to her brother. "Mom!" Rachel's voice was tight with something between anger and disbelief. Kevin just called me about the wedding. Did he explain his reasoning to you? He said you were upset about not being invited, but that it was just a practical decision based on the guest list size. Rachel paused, but then Ashley got on the phone and started talking about how they wanted the whole event to feel young and fresh, and how having older family members there would change the whole energy. So they were spreading their version of the story, making me sound unreasonable for being hurt by their practical decision. The manipulation was even more calculated than I'd realized. What do you think? I asked my daughter. I think they've lost their minds, Rachel said bluntly. Mom, you're paying for the entire wedding. You're Kevin's mother. The idea that you're too old to attend your own son's wedding is insane. Her outrage on my behalf felt like a balm, but it also highlighted just how far Kevin had strayed from basic family values. If Rachel, living 6 hours away and dealing with her own young family, could see the cruelty clearly, how had Kevin become so disconnected from simple human decency? There's more, Rachel continued. Ashley mentioned something about how they're planning to start house hunting soon and how helpful it would be to have family support for a down payment. She said it like she assumed you'd be contributing to that too. The presumption was breathtaking. Exclude me from the wedding but expect me to finance their future home purchase. Treat me as too embarrassing for their celebration but valuable. Enough as a source of funding for their dreams. I'm flying out there this weekend, Rachel declared. Someone needs to talk sense into Kevin, and apparently it's going to be me. After we hung up, I sat in the gathering twilight of Richard's study, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a family I'd thought I understood. The photos, the awards, the mementos of 35 years of building something together, all of it felt different now. Not worthless, but certainly not what I'd believed it to be. The house phone rang, an unusual occurrence in an age when most people used cell phones exclusively. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up the landline in Richard's study. Mrs. Thompson? The voice was young, female, slightly nervous. This is Sophia Chen from Elegant Affairs Wedding Planning. I'm calling about the Thompson Rodriguez wedding in September. Kevin's wedding planner. Calling me directly. Yes? I'm so sorry to bother you at home, but I wanted to clarify some details about the guest list. Mr. Thompson mentioned that there might be some changes, and I wanted to make sure I had the correct information before we finalize the invitations. My heart rate quickened. What kind of changes? Well, he mentioned that you might not be attending after all, but I wanted to confirm because, well, you're listed as the primary contact for payment, and it would be unusual for someone funding the entire event not to attend. Even the wedding planner found Kevin's decision strange. A professional who dealt with family dynamics for a living was confused by my son's choice to exclude me. Can you tell me something, Sophia? I asked. In your professional experience, how often do brides and grooms exclude their parents from their weddings? A pause. Mrs. Thompson, in 15 years of wedding planning, I've never had a situation where a parent was excluded purely for aesthetic reasons. I've seen family conflicts, divorces that created complications, feuds that required careful seating arrangements, but never anything like this. After I hung up, I made myself a simple dinner and ate it alone at the kitchen island, surrounded by wedding planning materials that now felt like evidence in a case I was building against my own son. Each vendor proposal, each venue photograph, each catering menu represented money I was expected to spend on an event I was forbidden to enjoy. The manipulation was elegant in its simplicity. Kevin got his perfect wedding funded by someone else's money. Ashley got her aesthetic vision realized without compromise, and I got the privilege of paying for my own exclusion. It was a business transaction disguised as a family celebration, and I'd been cast in the role of silent investor rather than honored mother. That night, I called Patricia at home, something I rarely did unless there was an emergency. "I've made my decision," I told her. "I want to change the will completely." "Are you sure? This is a big step, Maggie." "I'm sure. Kevin has made it clear how he values our relationship. I think it's time I responded in kind." "What about Rachel?" I thought about my daughter's outrage on my behalf, her willingness to fly across the country to defend me, her genuine shock at her brother's behavior. Rachel keeps her inheritance. She's earned it by being an actual daughter instead of just a financial beneficiary. Patricia was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do about the wedding payment?" "I'm going to pay for it," I said, surprising myself with the decision. "But not the way Kevin expects." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm going to make sure he gets exactly what he's paying for. Exactly what kind of wedding someone gets when they treat their mother like an inconvenience." Over the next few days, I began to understand that grief had prepared me for this in ways I never could have anticipated. Losing Richard had stripped away my illusions about permanence, about assuming love would always be there just because it always had been. It had taught me that relationships could end suddenly, that people could disappear from your life without warning, that you couldn't take anything for granted. Now Kevin was teaching me a different lesson, that sometimes people choose to disappear from your life gradually, through small cruelties and casual dismissals that eventually add up to complete abandonment. The difference was that this time, I had some control over how the story ended. I spent those days researching, planning, thinking through consequences and possibilities. Patricia had taught me that the law was a tool that could be used creatively, and I was beginning to understand just how many tools were available to someone in my position. Someone with resources, with legal representation, with nothing left to lose. Kevin called twice during those days, both times asking about wedding details with the casual assumption that nothing fundamental had changed between us. He wanted to know about the catering timeline, about transportation for out-of-town guests, about a dozen practical matters related to an event I still wasn't invited to attend. I answered his questions politely, efficiently, giving him no reason to suspect that anything was different. But everything was different. I was different. The woman who would have spent those days crying over the wedding magazines, heartbroken over her exclusion, was gone. In her place was someone harder, clearer, more focused on outcomes than emotions. By Friday afternoon, I had a plan that felt both perfectly just and completely devastating. Kevin wanted to treat me like a business transaction, and I was going to give him exactly that kind of relationship. Professional, efficient, and utterly without the warmth and forgiveness he'd always been able to count on. Rachel arrived that evening, driving straight from the airport to my house, her face tight with determination and residual anger. She hugged me fiercely in the driveway, and I realized how much I'd missed having someone on my side, someone who saw the situation clearly and wasn't trying to manage my emotions or manipulate my responses. "Have you talked to him yet?" she asked as we settled in the living room with glasses of wine. "Not about this directly. He's been calling about wedding logistics all week." Rachel shook her head in disgust. "The audacity is incredible. He excludes you from the wedding but still expects you to handle all the planning details." "Not anymore," I said quietly. Something in my tone made Rachel look at me more closely. "Mom, what are you planning?" I told her everything, from my meeting with Patricia to the research I'd been doing, to the decision I'd made about Kevin's inheritance. Rachel listened with growing amazement, and by the time I finished, she was grinning. "Mom, I had no idea you had this in you." "Neither did I admitted. "But apparently losing your husband and getting excluded from your son's wedding for being too old can bring out sides of yourself you never knew existed." We spent the evening refining the plan, adding details that would make the lesson more pointed, more memorable. Rachel had inherited her father's strategic mind, and she helped me think through angles I might have missed. By the time she went to bed in her childhood room, we had crafted something that felt like justice tempered, with just enough mercy to be defensible. Kevin was about to learn that treating family like a convenience comes with a price tag he hadn't calculated. And I was about to discover just how strong a woman could be when she finally stopped making excuses for people who didn't deserve them. Saturday morning brought Rachel and me to Thompson & Associates headquarters, a gleaming office complex that Richard and I had built 5 years ago, when the company had outgrown our original location. Walking through those doors with my daughter beside me, I felt something shift inside me. For months, I'd been avoiding this place, leaving the day-to-day operations to Frank Martinez, our longtime business partner and general manager. The office reminded me too much of Richard, of the dreams we'd shared, of the future we'd planned together. Now, however, it felt like reclaiming territory. These walls, this business, the 43 employees who depended on Thompson & Associates for their livelihoods, all of it represented something Kevin had never bothered to understand or appreciate. He saw only the dollar signs, the inheritance, potential, never the decades of relationships and reputation that had built this legacy. Frank looked surprised to see me, especially on a Saturday morning, and especially with Rachel in tow. He was a bear of a man, 62 years old with calloused hands and a face weathered by 30 years in the California sun. Richard had hired him fresh out of college as a junior project manager, and he'd grown into the kind of partner you could trust with your life savings or your company's future. "Maggie," he said, standing to embrace me. "This is unexpected. Everything all right?" Frank had been at Richard's funeral, had checked on me regularly in the month since, had handled the business side of things while I grieved. He was also one of the few people who knew Kevin well enough to have formed his own opinions about my son's character. "I need to show Rachel the business," I said simply. "And I need to understand some things about the company structure that I haven't paid attention to." We spent the morning walking through every department, from the architectural design team to the project management offices, to the financial department where Linda Carter, our chief financial officer, maintained meticulous records of every transaction, every investment, every profit and loss. Rachel asked intelligent questions, the kind Kevin had never bothered with during his rare visits to the office. "Dad really built something amazing," Rachel said, as we stood in the conference room where deals worth millions of dollars had been negotiated over the years. The walls were covered with photographs of completed projects, families standing in front of homes that Thompson & Associates had made possible. "Your father had a vision," Frank said, his voice carrying the respect and affection that had defined his relationship with Richard. "He believed that building homes was about building communities, creating places where families could thrive for generations." I thought about Kevin's assessment of the family business as a source of inheritance income, his complete lack of interest in the work itself, the people who depended on it, or the values that had driven its success. He'd visited the office perhaps 6 times in the past 5 years, always briefly, always with the air of someone fulfilling an obligation rather than exploring an opportunity. "Frank," I said carefully, "has Kevin ever expressed any interest in joining the company? Any questions about how we operate or what our future plans might be?" Frank's expression became guarded, the way it did when he was choosing his words, carefully. Not exactly interest in joining, more like questions about valuation, about what the company might be worth if it were sold. Another piece of Kevin's puzzle clicked into place. He wasn't just counting on inheriting money. He was counting on inheriting something he could liquidate quickly. The business that Richard and I had spent 35 years building, that employed dozens of people, that had become an integral part of Riverside's development, was nothing more than a potential cash conversion in Kevin's mind. "When did he ask these questions?" Rachel wanted to know. "About 6 months ago," Frank said reluctantly. "Right around the time he got engaged. He wanted to know about market conditions, what commercial real estate development companies were selling for, how quickly assets could be converted if someone wanted to get out of the business." The timeline was damning. Kevin had started planning his exit strategy from the family business before he'd even announced his engagement, certainly before he'd decided I was too old to attend his wedding. This wasn't about aesthetics or guest list management. This was about positioning himself to access and liquidate his inheritance as quickly as possible. "Did you tell him anything?" I asked. Frank shook his head firmly. "I told him those were conversations he needed to have with you, that Richard had always insisted family discussions stay within the family." We spent another hour with Linda Carter, reviewing the company's financial position, its growth projections, its current market value. The numbers were impressive, representing not just financial success but the kind of stable, growing business that could support multiple families for generations if managed properly. "Mrs. Thompson," Linda said as we prepared to leave, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but I'm glad to see you taking a more active interest in the company again. We've all been wondering about the long-term plans, especially with Kevin, showing so little involvement." Her words confirmed what I'd begun to suspect. The employees had noticed Kevin's absence, his lack of engagement, his apparent disinterest in the business that would someday partially belong to him. They'd been worried about their futures, about what would happen when leadership passed to someone who saw the company as a commodity rather than a calling. That afternoon, Rachel and I drove to the Silverado Resort in Napa Valley, the venue Kevin had chosen for his wedding. I'd made the appointment under the pretense of finalizing details, but my real purpose was to see exactly what kind of celebration I was being excluded from, exactly how my money was being spent on an event designed specifically to humiliate me. The resort was breathtaking, exactly the kind of place that would photograph beautifully for Instagram and impress Kevin's banking colleagues and Ashley's marketing executive friends. Rolling vineyards, perfectly manicured gardens, a ceremony site overlooking the valley that would create the kind of backdrop magazine editors dreamed of. Jessica Walsh, the venue coordinator, greeted us with the kind of professional enthusiasm that came from years of dealing with wealthy clients planning elaborate celebrations. She assumed Rachel was the bride, a mistake I didn't immediately correct, because I wanted to see how the conversation would unfold. "I'm so excited to show you what we've planned," Jessica said, leading us through the ceremony space. "Your fiancé has such specific vision for how he wants everything to look. Very modern, very sophisticated." She showed us the seating arrangement Kevin had approved. Intimate clusters of tables for 50 guests, each one positioned for optimal photography and conversation flow. The guest list, she explained, was carefully curated to create the right demographic mix, the right energy for the celebration they were trying to achieve. "Demographic mix?" Rachel asked, her voice carefully neutral. "Young professionals mostly," Jessica said proudly. "Everyone under 40, very stylish, very photogenic." Mr. Thompson was very clear that he wanted the whole event to feel contemporary and fresh. No older relatives who might change the energy or complicate the aesthetic. The casual cruelty of it, delivered with such professional polish, was almost artistic in its precision. Kevin hadn't just excluded me, he'd created an entire event, strategy designed around my absence, my unsuitability for his vision of sophistication. "What about family?" Rachel pressed. "Surely there are some older relatives who are important to the couple." Jessica looked slightly uncomfortable. "Well, there was some discussion about the groom's mother, but ultimately they decided that intimate didn't necessarily mean inclusive of everyone. They're planning a separate celebration for extended family later. A separate celebration, a consolation prize for the inconvenient relatives who didn't fit the aesthetic vision. The manipulation was breathtaking in its casual efficiency. We toured the entire facility, from the bridal suite where Ashley would prepare for her perfect day to the reception hall where Kevin's carefully selected guests would celebrate without me. Every detail had been chosen to create exactly the kind of sophisticated, youthful celebration that my presence would apparently contaminate. "The budget is quite generous," Jessica mentioned as we concluded the tour. $150,000 allows for some really special touches. The imported flowers alone are costing $20,000, and the photographer is flying in from New York specifically for this event. $20,000 for flowers that would die within days. A photographer from New York to capture memories I'd never see. Money I was paying to fund my own exclusion from what should have been one of the most important days of my son's life. On the drive back to Riverside, Rachel was quiet for a long time, staring out at the passing vineyard landscape. Finally, she spoke. "Mom, I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For not seeing this sooner, for making excuses for Kevin, for thinking he was just busy or focused on his career. This isn't about being busy. This is about who he's become." Her words carried the weight of recognition, the painful acknowledgement that sometimes the people we love most are capable of stunning cruelty. Rachel had always defended her brother, made allowances for his distance, interpreted his behavior in the most charitable possible light. Now she was seeing him clearly for the first time. "When did he change?" she asked. "When did he become someone who could exclude his own mother from his wedding for aesthetic reasons?" I'd been asking myself the same question for days. "I think it happened gradually," I said finally. "Each time we made excuses for him, each time we adapted our expectations to accommodate his behavior, each time we accepted less respect and consideration because we loved him, we trained him to see us as optional." "But not anymore," Rachel said firmly. "No, not anymore." That evening, Patricia joined us for dinner at the house, bringing with her a thick folder of legal documents that represented the new reality I was creating. We spread everything across the dining room table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of family meals, where Kevin had done his homework as a child, where Richard and I had made countless decisions about our life together. "I've drafted everything according to your specifications," Patricia said, opening the folder. "But I want to make sure you understand the implications before we proceed." The new will was elegantly simple. Rachel would inherit my share of Thompson & Associates along with the family home and the majority of our real estate investments. A trust would be established to ensure the business continued operating according to Richard's vision, employing the people who had helped build it, serving the community that had supported it. Kevin would receive exactly what he'd demonstrated he valued: a cash settlement of $50,000, enough to make a down payment on a modest home if he chose to live within his means. No stake in the business he'd shown no interest in, understanding. No claim on the legacy he'd been eager to liquidate. "The timing is important," Patricia explained. "If we execute these changes before the wedding, Kevin has no legal recourse. The money is yours to dispose of as you see fit." "What about the wedding payment?" Rachel asked. I smiled, thinking about the plan we'd refined over the past few days. "Oh, I'm still paying for the wedding, every penny I promised, but there are going to be some modifications to the arrangement." Over the next hour, I outlined exactly how Kevin's perfect celebration was going to unfold. He'd get his intimate gathering of young professionals, his sophisticated aesthetic, his Instagram-worthy venue, but he was also going to get a very clear message about the cost of treating family as dispensable. "Maggie," Patricia said when I finished explaining, "this is either brilliant or completely insane." "Maybe both," I admitted, "but it's what he's earned." Sunday morning arrived with the kind of perfect California weather that made everything seem possible. Rachel and I had breakfast on the patio, surrounded by the garden Richard and I had planted together, discussing the final details of what we'd started calling the education of Kevin Thompson. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Rachel asked. "Once we set this in motion, there's no going back." I thought about the question seriously. Was I ready to fundamentally alter my relationship with my son? Was I prepared for the anger, the accusations, the permanent change this would create in our family dynamic? Then I thought about the casual cruelty in Kevin's voice when he'd told me I was too old for his wedding. I thought about his questions to Frank about liquidating the business. I thought about his assumption that I'd continue funding his dreams. while accepting my exclusion from his celebrations. "I'm ready," I said. "Kevin wants to treat me like a bank account instead of his mother. It's time he learned what kind of interest rate that arrangement actually carries." The first phase of the plan began with a phone call to Sophia Chen, Kevin's wedding planner. The conversation was brief, professional, and absolutely devastating in its implications. "Ms. Chen, this is Margaret Thompson. I need to make some changes to the wedding arrangements." "Of course, Mrs. Thompson. What kind of changes?" "I'm reducing the budget to $25,000, effective immediately." The silence on the other end of the line was profound. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson, but I don't understand. The current budget is $150,000, and most of that has already been committed to vendors. Then you'll need to make different arrangements. $25,000 is more than sufficient for the kind of intimate gathering Kevin has described. I'm sure a creative professional like yourself can work within those parameters. But, Mrs. Thompson, the deposits alone exceed that amount. The flowers, the photographer, the catering, the venue rental, everything has been selected based on the original budget." "That sounds like Kevin and Ashley's problem to solve," I said calmly. "I've decided that $25,000 is an appropriate amount for someone in Kevin's position to spend on a wedding. If he wants something more elaborate, he's welcome to pay for it himself." After I hung up, Rachel looked at me with something approaching awe. "Phase 1 complete?" "Phase 1 complete. Now we wait for the phone to ring." It took exactly 17 minutes. Kevin's number flashed on my phone with the urgency of someone who'd just received very bad news from his wedding planner. "Mom, what the hell is going on? Sophia just called and said you're cutting the wedding budget to $25,000. That's impossible. We can't have the wedding we planned with that amount." "Hello, Kevin," I said pleasantly. "I've been thinking about what you said regarding the wedding, about keeping things intimate and appropriate for someone in your position." "My position? What does that mean?" "Well, you're a young man just starting out, building your own life, creating your own family. $25,000 is quite generous for someone at your stage of life. It's certainly more than your father and I spent on our wedding." "But you promised $150,000, Kevin said, his voice rising with panic. "Everything is already arranged. We can't change everything now." "I promised to pay for your wedding," I corrected. "I never specified that I would pay for a wedding I wasn't invited to attend. Since you've made it clear that my presence would diminish your celebration, I've adjusted my contribution accordingly." The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Kevin spoke again, his voice carried a note of barely controlled desperation. "Mom, this is crazy. You can't do this to us." "I'm not doing anything to you, Kevin. I'm simply responding to what you've taught me about our relationship. If I'm too old and aesthetically inappropriate to attend your wedding, then perhaps I'm also too old and out of touch to understand what kind of celebration young people like yourselves really need." "That's not what I meant, and you know it." "Is it not? Because that's exactly what you said. That my presence would change the demographic mix you were trying to achieve. That having older relatives there would ruin the energy. That you wanted everything to feel young and fresh." Could hear Ashley's voice in the background, shrill with panic, though I couldn't make out the words. "Look," Kevin said, his tone shifting to the placating voice he used when he wanted something. "Maybe we can work something out. Maybe there's a way to include you after all." "Oh, Kevin," I said sadly. "It's too late for that. You've already made your priorities clear. You want a celebration without me, and I'm going to make sure you get exactly what you asked for." After I hung up, Rachel was grinning. "How do you feel?" "Like I'm finally learning to speak Kevin's language," I said. "Money." The phone rang again within minutes, then again, then again. Kevin called 4 times in the next hour, each conversation more desperate than the last. By the 4th call, Ashley had taken the phone herself. "Mrs. Thompson, I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Kevin explained things poorly. "Of course we want you at the wedding. We've just been so overwhelmed with planning that we haven't communicated well." "Ashley," I said gently, "I appreciate you calling, but there's no misunderstanding. Kevin was very clear about what kind of wedding he wanted, and I'm simply making sure he gets it. A young, fresh, contemporary celebration that reflects his values and priorities. But the vendors, the deposits, everything is already arranged based on the larger budget. Then I suppose you and Kevin will need to decide what's most important to you. You can have the expensive wedding you planned and pay for it yourselves, or you can have the $25,000 wedding I'm willing to fund. The choice is entirely yours." "Kevin's inheritance," Ashley said suddenly, abandoning any pretense of politeness. "His share of the family business. Surely that can cover the difference." There it was, the real reason for Kevin's sudden interest. In marriage, Ashley's enthusiasm for joining the Thompson family, their casual dismissal of my importance in their lives. They'd been counting on Kevin's inheritance to fund not just the wedding, but their entire future lifestyle. "Ashley," I said, my voice still gentle but carrying an edge of steel, "Kevin doesn't have an inheritance anymore. That's another bridge. He burned when he decided I was too old to be part of his new life." The silence that followed was profound, and when Ashley spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "What do you mean he doesn't have an inheritance?" "I mean that actions have consequences, and Kevin is about to learn what those consequences look like. The same way you're both learning what a $25,000 wedding looks like." After I hung up, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Not quite happiness, but a deep sense of satisfaction, of rightness, of finally responding to cruelty with appropriate consequences rather than endless forgiveness. Kevin and Ashley had made their choices based on what they thought they could get away with, what they thought I would tolerate, what they assumed I would continue to provide regardless of how they treated me. They were about to discover that love, even maternal love, has limits, and that those limits come with very real costs. The transformation was complete. The grieving widow who would have accepted any crumb of affection from her son was gone, replaced by a woman who understood her own worth and was willing to defend it. Kevin had wanted to exclude me from his celebration of starting a new family. Now he was going to learn what it felt like to be excluded from mine. The drive from Los Angeles to Riverside had never seemed longer. Kevin called 3 times during Rachel's trip to the airport, each message more frantic than the last. By Tuesday evening, when he finally arrived at my house unannounced, his usual polished appearance had cracked around the edges. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and there were dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights spent calculating the financial disaster I'd created for him. I watched from the living room window as he sat in his BMW in my driveway for several minutes, clearly steeling himself for a conversation he'd never imagined having to have. When he finally rang the doorbell, I took my time answering, allowing him to stand there long enough to appreciate the symbolism of waiting for permission to enter the home he'd always taken for granted. "Mom," he said when I opened the door, his voice carefully controlled but strained around the edges. "We need to talk." "Of course," I replied pleasantly, stepping aside to let him in. "Though I should mention that Patricia is joining us this evening. I thought it would be helpful to have legal counsel present for whatever you wanted to discuss." The mention of our family attorney's presence clearly rattled him, though he tried to hide it. Kevin had always been skilled at reading situations, at understanding power dynamics and positioning himself advantageously. Now he was walking into a conversation where he held none of the cards, and his discomfort was obvious. We settled in the living room, the same space where he'd played as a child, where Richard had taught him chess, where we'd celebrated his acceptance to USC Business School. The family photos lining the mantel seemed to mock the distance between The loving son in those pictures and the calculating stranger sitting across from me now. Patricia should be here shortly, I said, pouring myself a glass of wine from the bottle I'd opened earlier. Can I get you anything? Mom, please, Kevin said, abandoning any pretense of casual conversation. Let's just talk about this reasonably. This whole situation has gotten out of hand. Has it? I thought I was simply responding to your clearly expressed preferences about our relationship. Patricia arrived before Kevin could respond, her presence immediately shifting the energy in the room. She'd changed from her usual business attire into dark jeans and a cashmere sweater, but she carried her leather briefcase with the kind of purposeful efficiency that reminded everyone present that this was, ultimately, a legal matter. Kevin, she said coolly, offering him a handshake rather than the warm greeting she'd always given him in the past. I understand you wanted to discuss some family matters. Patricia, I think there's been a misunderstanding, Kevin began, his banker's training kicking in as he tried to control the narrative. Mom seems to think I don't want her at the wedding, but that's not accurate. We've just been trying to manage a complex guest list situation. Complex how? Patricia asked, settling into the chair beside mine and opening her briefcase with deliberate precision. Kevin glanced between us, clearly recognizing that he was facing a united front he'd never encountered before. Well, the venue has capacity limitations, and Ashley's family has specific cultural expectations about guest demographics. We're trying to balance multiple considerations. Cultural expectations about guest demographics, I repeated slowly. Is that what we're calling ageism now? It's not ageism, Kevin protested, though his flush suggested otherwise. It's about creating a cohesive celebration that reflects our values and lifestyle. Patricia withdrew a small digital recorder from her briefcase and placed it on the coffee table between us. Kevin, I'm going to record this conversation for documentation purposes. I want to make sure we have a clear record of everyone's position on these matters. The recorder seemed to rattle Kevin more than anything else that had happened. The idea that his words were being preserved, that there would be legal documentation of this conversation, clearly hadn't occurred to him. Is that really necessary? He asked. Given the financial implications of this discussion, yes, Patricia replied matter-of-factly. Your mother has made significant changes to her estate planning based on your expressed preferences about family relationships. We want to ensure everyone understands the reasoning behind those decisions. Kevin's face went pale. What kind of changes? I leaned forward, my voice gentle but firm. Kevin, you've made it very clear that I don't fit into your new life, that my presence would be embarrassing to you and Ashley, that my age makes me inappropriate for your social circle, that your celebration would be better without me. I've simply adjusted my own planning to reflect those realities. I never said you were embarrassing, he protested weakly. You said my presence would ruin the aesthetic you were trying to achieve. You said having older relatives there would change the energy of your wedding. You excluded me from an event I was paying for because I didn't fit your demographic vision. My voice remained calm, but each word landed with precision. How exactly would you characterize that behavior? Kevin was quiet for a long moment, clearly trying to find a way to reframe his actions that didn't sound as cruel as they actually were. I was trying to create something special for Ashley. Her family has very specific expectations. About what? About sophistication, about the kind of people we associate with, about the image we project as a couple. Patricia made a note on her legal pad. And your mother doesn't meet those standards. It's not about standards, Kevin said desperately. It's about fit, about creating the right atmosphere. For people who judge others based on age, I said quietly. For people who believe that family becomes dispensable when it doesn't enhance your social image. The conversation continued for another hour, with Kevin growing increasingly frantic, as he realized that no amount of explanation or rationalization was going to undo the consequences of his choices. Patricia methodically documented every justification he offered, every reason he gave for excluding me, every assumption he revealed about my role in his life. "Let's talk about the business," Patricia said eventually, consulting her notes. "Kevin, you've had several conversations with Frank Martinez about Thompson & Associates' market value and potential for liquidation. Can you explain your interest in those topics?" Kevin's expression grew wary. "I was just trying to understand the family assets. That's normal financial planning." "Financial planning for what purpose?" "For the future. For understanding what resources might be available for major purchases, investments, that kind of thing." "Such as?" Kevin glanced at me, clearly hoping I would intervene, but I remained silent. This was his conversation to navigate. "Ashley and I have been looking at houses in Manhattan Beach. The real estate market there is very competitive, and we wanted to understand what kind of financing options might be available through family resources." "Houses in Manhattan Beach," Patricia repeated. "That's quite expensive real estate. What price range were you considering?" $2 to $3 million, Kevin admitted reluctantly. The number hung in the air between us. Kevin had been planning to use his inheritance to purchase a house worth more than most people earned in a lifetime, while simultaneously excluding me from his wedding for being too old and inappropriate for his new social circle. "And you assumed your inheritance would cover that purchase?" "I assumed it would help with the down payment and financial qualification, yes." Patricia made another note. "Kevin, are you aware that your mother's will originally left you 50% of her estate, including her share of Thompson & Associates?" "Yes." "And are you aware that she's now changed that will to leave you a cash settlement of $50,000 with no stake in the business or other family assets?" The color drained from Kevin's face completely. $50,000? That's impossible. You can't just cut me out of the family inheritance. "Actually, I can," I said quietly. "It's my money, Kevin. Money I earned through 35 years of hard work building a business you've shown no interest in understanding or preserving. Money I plan to leave to children who valued family relationships and treated their parents with respect." "This is insane," Kevin said, standing up abruptly and beginning to pace. "You're destroying our family over a misunderstanding about a guest list." "I'm not destroying anything," I replied. "I'm simply responding to the family you've already destroyed through your choices and priorities." "What about Ashley? What about our future? We've made plans based on reasonable expectations. About family support. Plans that included excluding me from your wedding and liquidating the business your father spent his life building," Patricia observed. "Plans that treated your mother as a source of funding rather than a member of your family." Kevin stopped, pacing and stared at me with something approaching desperation. "Mom, please. I know I handled the wedding situation poorly. I know I hurt your feelings, but this is too extreme. You're punishing me for life over one mistake." "One mistake?" I stood up, facing my son directly. "Kevin, this isn't about one mistake. This is about who you've become. This is about a pattern of behavior that treats family as conditional, love as transactional, and relationships as disposable when they don't serve your immediate purposes. That's not true, isn't it? When was the last time you visited this house when you didn't want something? When was the last time you called just to check on me, to see how I was doing as a widow learning to live alone? When was the last time you showed any interest in the business that built your entire life of privilege, or the people who work there, or the legacy your father wanted to leave?" Kevin opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again, clearly unable to provide examples that would contradict my assessment. "You've spent years taking this family for granted," I continued, "accepting financial support while offering nothing in return. Treating this house as a hotel when it was convenient. Treating me as a bank when you needed money. treating our relationship as something you could manipulate to serve your purposes. I never thought of it that way. No, you didn't. Think of it at all. That's the problem. You assumed my love was unconditional, that my support would always be available regardless of how you treated me, that family was something you could take from without ever giving back. Patricia cleared her throat gently. Kevin, there is one option available to you. Your mother's will includes provisions for reinstating your inheritance under specific conditions. Hope flickered across Kevin's face. What conditions? You would need to demonstrate a genuine commitment to family relationships and to understanding the business your father built. That would mean working at Thompson & Associates for at least 2 years in a meaningful capacity, not as a figurehead, but as someone learning the company from the ground up. Working there? But I have my own career. Yes, you do, and that career is more important to you than family relationships or preserving your father's legacy, which is exactly why the inheritance is no longer yours. Kevin looked between Patricia and me, clearly trying to calculate whether 2 years of work he had no interest in was worth the financial benefit he'd been counting on. What about the wedding budget? He asked finally. What about it? I replied. You cut it to $25,000. The whole celebration is ruined. Ashley is devastated. Her family is humiliated. Ashley's family is humiliated because you planned an expensive wedding you couldn't afford, based on money you hadn't earned from people you were excluding from the celebration, Patricia said bluntly. That's not your mother's problem to solve. But you promised to pay for the wedding. I am paying for the wedding. $25,000 is more than sufficient for an intimate celebration of 50 people. If you want something more elaborate, you're welcome to pay for it yourself. Kevin sank back into his chair, the weight of his situation finally settling on him. This is going to destroy everything. Ashley's family has already sent invitations. People have made travel arrangements. The vendors are demanding full payment or they're canceling. Then you have some difficult decisions to make, I said gently. You can have the modest wedding I'm willing to fund, you can pay for the elaborate celebration you planned with your own money, or you can postpone the wedding until you can afford what you want. We don't have that kind of money. Then, perhaps you should have considered that before excluding the person who was providing it. The conversation wound down with Kevin making increasingly desperate offers to compromise, to find middle ground, to somehow undo the consequences of his choices without actually acknowledging the cruelty of those choices. He offered to include me in the wedding if I restored the budget. He offered to visit more often if I restored his inheritance. He offered to show more interest in the business if I would change the will back to its original terms. Each offer revealed the transactional way he viewed our relationship, the assumption that love and respect were commodities he could trade for financial benefit, rather than genuine emotions that had to be earned and maintained through consistent behavior. Kevin, I said as he prepared to leave, his expression a mixture of anger and desperation. I want you to understand something. This isn't about revenge. This isn't about punishing you for the sake of punishment. This is about teaching you something your father and I failed to teach you when you were young. What's that? That relationships have value beyond what they can provide you. That family is something you invest in, not something you withdraw from. That love requires reciprocity, respect requires demonstration, and inheritance requires worthiness. He stood in my doorway, the same doorway he'd run through as a child coming home from school. The same doorway he'd walked through with pride when he'd graduated college. The same doorway he'd barely bothered to enter in recent years unless he needed something. This isn't over, he said finally. Yes, it is, I replied calmly. This version of our relationship is completely over. What happens next depends entirely on what you decide is more important to you, your family, or your image, your father's. Legacy or your own convenience, love or money. After he left, Patricia and I sat in the quiet living room, the digital recorder still running, though the conversation had ended. How do you feel? she asked. Like I just performed surgery on my own heart, I admitted. But like it was surgery that had to be done to save the patient. He might change, you know. This could be the wake-up call he needs. He might, I agreed. But even if he doesn't, I've changed. I've learned that love without boundaries isn't really love at all. It's just enablement disguised as affection. Patricia packed up her recorder and her notes, documenting the conversation that would serve as evidence of Kevin's mindset should he later claim his exclusion from the inheritance was unfair or unexpected. The new will is ready for your signature whenever you're prepared, she said. And Maggie? You should be proud of yourself. What you did tonight took tremendous courage. Did it? Or was it just finally accepting reality instead of living in denial about who my son had become? Maybe both. Maybe that's what courage looks like when you're a mother dealing with a disappointing child. That night, I sat alone in Richard's study, surrounded by photos of Kevin at every stage of his life. The baby who'd seemed like a miracle after years of trying to conceive. The toddler who'd followed Richard around job sites with wide-eyed wonder. The teenager who'd worked summers at Thompson and Associates, learning the value of hard work and honest labor. The college graduate who'd seemed poised to build on the foundation we'd provided. Somewhere along the way, that foundation had cracked. The values we'd tried to instill had been eroded by prosperity, by distance, by the gradual realization that he could take without giving, receive without reciprocating, benefit without appreciating. But foundations could be rebuilt, values could be relearned, relationships could be restored if both parties were willing to do the work. Kevin would have to decide whether his family was worth that effort, whether his father's legacy was worth preserving, whether love was worth more than money. I'd spent 30 years making excuses for his choices, adapting my expectations to accommodate his behavior, accepting less and less respect in exchange for more and more financial support. That version of our relationship was indeed over, as I'd told him. What came next would depend entirely on what kind of man he chose to be. September arrived with an intensity that matched my newly discovered resolve. Kevin's wedding day dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect California morning that would have made any celebration feel blessed. I woke early in my empty house, made coffee for one, and sat on the patio Richard had designed to catch the morning sun. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt peaceful, like the quiet after a storm has passed and the air has cleared. Kevin hadn't spoken to me since that evening in my living room with Patricia 3 weeks earlier. His silence spoke volumes about his priorities and his character, but it no longer surprised or devastated me. I'd learned to read the language of his choices, and this particular silence said everything I needed to know about what mattered most to him. Ashley had called twice in those 3 weeks, her voice progressively more strained as the reality of their financial situation became clear. The first call had been angry, accusatory, demanding that I explain why I was destroying their special day over what she characterized as a minor family disagreement. The second call had been desperate, pleading, offering compromises that revealed just how thoroughly they'd miscalculated their position. During that second conversation, Ashley had finally revealed the true scope of their predicament. The original wedding vendors were demanding full payment before proceeding with any services. The venue was threatening cancellation unless the remaining balance was settled immediately. The photographer from New York had already been paid a non-refundable deposit, but was requiring an additional $15,000 before the wedding date. Their perfect celebration was collapsing under the weight of its own expensive ambitions. "Mrs. Thompson," Ashley had said, her voice cracking with stress, "Kevin's father would want him to have a beautiful wedding. This is what Richard would have wanted for his son." The manipulation attempt was so transparent, so calculated, that I'd almost admired its audacity. Using my dead husband's memory to guilt me into funding a celebration I'd been excluded from was a level of callousness that even Kevin hadn't attempted. "Ashley," I'd replied calmly. Richard would have wanted his son to treat his mother with respect and consideration. Since that apparently wasn't important enough to Kevin to maintain, I don't think we need to speculate about what Richard would have wanted regarding the wedding. Now, as I sat in my garden on their wedding morning, I wondered what kind of celebration they'd managed to salvage with the reduced budget I'd provided. Had they found a way to make the intimate gathering work? Or had they chosen to postpone rather than accept something less than their Instagram-perfect vision? At 10 a.m., my phone rang. Rachel's name appeared on the screen and I answered with genuine pleasure. My daughter had been my anchor through these difficult weeks, offering support without judgment, validation without requiring me to justify my decisions. "Mom," Rachel's voice carried an odd note of suppressed amusement. "I have some news about Kevin's wedding." "Oh?" "I just got off the phone with Carmen Rodriguez, Ashley's mother. Apparently, they went ahead with the celebration, but had to make some significant adjustments to accommodate the budget reduction." Rachel proceeded to paint a picture that was almost artistic in its irony. The Silverado Resort had been replaced with a community center in Riverside, the same kind of modest venue where Richard and I had celebrated our own wedding 35 years earlier. The imported flowers had been replaced with arrangements from the local grocery store. The photographer from New York had been replaced with a recent photography school graduate who worked weekends for extra income. The guest list, originally curated for optimal demographics and social media impact, had been expanded to include Ashley's extended family after her parents insisted that if the celebration was going to be modest, it should at least be genuinely familial. The sophisticated, youth-focused aesthetic Kevin had prioritized was replaced with the kind of multi-generational gathering that actually reflected the reality of joining two families together. "The best part," Rachel continued, "is that Ashley's grandmother, who's 82 and apparently quite opinionated, spent the entire reception asking where you were and why the groom's mother wasn't present. According to Carmen, she made quite a scene about the disrespect being shown to Kevin's family." The image of Ashley trying to explain to her own grandmother why she'd excluded her future mother-in-law for being too old was so perfectly poetic that I found myself genuinely smiling for the first time in weeks. Carmen also mentioned that Kevin seemed distracted throughout the entire ceremony, Rachel added, like his mind was somewhere else entirely. I could imagine what Kevin had been thinking about during his wedding ceremony. Not the joy of the moment or the commitment he was making to Ashley, but the financial implications of the choices that had led him to this stripped-down celebration, the inheritance he'd lost, the future he'd been forced to recalculate without, the resources he'd been counting on. "How do you feel about all this?" Rachel asked gently. I considered the question seriously. How did I feel about my son getting married in a modest community center instead of a luxury resort? How did I feel about his expensive dreams being reduced to budget reality? How did I feel about missing his wedding day entirely? "I feel like natural consequences are playing out exactly as they should," I said finally. Kevin wanted a wedding that reflected his values and priorities. He got exactly that. "And you're okay with missing it?" "Rachel, I didn't miss anything meaningful. What happened today was a celebration of Kevin and Ashley's vision of their future together. A vision that explicitly excluded me. If I'd been there, I would have been witnessing something I was never meant to be part of." "That's very philosophical of you." "It's very realistic of me. I spent too many years pretending Kevin was someone he wasn't, making excuses for behavior that was inexcusable, accepting treatment that was unacceptable. Today was just the logical conclusion of patterns that had been building for years." After we hung up, I spent the afternoon in Richard's study, going through files and documents I'd been avoiding since his death. Among his papers, I found a letter he'd written but never sent, dated just 2 months before his cancer diagnosis. It was addressed to Kevin, and as I read it, I understood that Richard had seen our son's character flaws long before I'd been willing to acknowledge them. The letter expressed Richard's concerns about Kevin's financial decisions, his lack of involvement in the family business, his apparent assumption that success would be handed to him rather than earned. Richard had written about his disappointment in Kevin's treatment of me, his worry that our son had become someone who took more than he gave, who saw family as a resource to be exploited rather than a relationship to be nurtured. "I fear," Richard had written, "that we've given Kevin so much that he's never learned to appreciate anything. He expects love without reciprocating it, support without earning it, inheritance without proving himself worthy of it. I worry about what kind of man he's becoming and what kind of legacy we're actually leaving him." Richard had seen it all, had understood the trajectory Kevin was on, but he'd died before he could address it directly. Now I was doing what Richard might have done if he'd lived longer, setting boundaries that should have been established years earlier, requiring accountability that should have been demanded long ago. That evening, Patricia called to update me on the legal status of various documents and arrangements. The new will had been filed and properly witnessed. Kevin's inheritance had been officially reduced to the $50,000 settlement, with the remainder redirected to Rachel and to a charitable foundation that would support local families seeking affordable housing through Thompson and Associates work. "Have you heard anything from Kevin since the wedding?" Patricia asked. "Nothing, and I don't expect to, at least not until he needs something else. What if he decides to take the offer about working at the company? Then he'll learn whether he's capable of genuine change or whether he's just trying to manipulate his way back into the inheritance. Either way, we'll know where we stand. And if he doesn't take the offer, then he's made his choice, and I've made mine. I can live with the consequences of my decisions. The question is whether he can live with the consequences of his." October brought an unexpected visitor to my door. Frank Martinez from Thompson and Associates arrived on a Saturday morning with coffee and pastries from the bakery downtown, his weathered face carrying the kind of serious expression that meant he had something important to discuss. "Maggie," he said as we settled in the kitchen, "I've got some news about Kevin." My heart did that automatic skip it always did when anyone mentioned my son, despite everything that had happened. "What kind of news?" "He came to the office yesterday, asked for a meeting with me and Linda Carter, said he wanted to discuss the possibility of joining the company." The development surprised me more than it should have. Kevin had always been strategic, always calculating, but I hadn't expected him to move this quickly or directly toward the option Patricia had outlined. "What did he say?" Frank's expression remained carefully neutral. He said he'd been thinking about his father's legacy and his own future. Said he wanted to understand the business better and explore whether there might be a place for him at Thompson and Associates. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him that any employment decisions would need to be discussed with you, since you're the majority owner. But I also told him that if he was serious about learning the business, he'd need to start at the bottom and work his way up like everyone else." Frank paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maggie, I've got to ask, is this about the inheritance situation Patricia mentioned?" I'd told Frank the basic outline of what had happened, though not all the details. He'd worked with Richard for decades and had his own opinions about Kevin's character and worthiness. "Partly," I admitted, "but also about genuine accountability. If Kevin wants to be part of this family's legacy, he needs to prove he understands what that legacy actually means. And if he's just trying to manipulate his way back into your good graces, then 2 years of actual work will reveal that pretty quickly." Frank nodded approvingly. Richard always said that construction work had a way of showing you who people really were. Can't fake your way through building something that has to stand up to weather and time. We spent an hour discussing the practical aspects of Kevin, potentially joining Thompson and Associates, what position he might start in, what kind of training he'd need, how his progress would be evaluated. Frank was skeptical but fair, willing to give Kevin a chance if it was genuine while making it clear that family connections wouldn't excuse poor performance or bad attitude. "One more thing," Frank said as he prepared to leave. Ashley called. The office, too. Asked about health insurance coverage for spouses of employees. The detail was telling. Kevin and Ashley were already calculating the practical benefits of his potential employment, already figuring out how to extract maximum value from the arrangement. Whether that represented genuine interest in joining the company or just another form of manipulation remained to be seen. November brought Kevin himself to my door, arriving unannounced on a rainy Thursday evening. He looked different than he had during our confrontation in September, less polished, more uncertain. His expensive suit had been replaced with khakis and a sweater, his usual confident demeanor softened by something that might have been humility or might have been calculation. "Mom," he said when I opened the door. "Can we talk?" I led him to the living room, the same space where we'd had so many conversations over the years, where he'd told me about his first job, his engagement, his plans for the future. Now we sat across from each other like negotiators rather than family members, each uncertain of the other's position. "Frank told me about your visit to the office," I said, offering him neither criticism nor encouragement. "I've been thinking about what you said, about Dad's legacy, about the business, about what kind of man I want to be." Kevin's voice carried a note of something I hadn't heard in years, uncertainty mixed with what might have been genuine introspection. "And what conclusions have you reached?" "That I've been an ass," he said bluntly. "That I've taken you and Dad for granted. That I've treated this family like it existed to serve my purposes instead of being something I should invest in." The words were what I'd wanted to hear for months, but I'd learned to listen for the motivation behind Kevin's statements rather than just their content. "What's changed your mind?" I asked. Kevin was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. "The wedding was terrible, Mom. Not because of the budget or the venue or any of the practical stuff. It was terrible because the whole time I kept thinking about how wrong it felt that you weren't there. But you're the one who didn't want me there." "I know, and I was wrong. Completely, stupidly wrong." He looked up at me, and for a moment I saw a flash of the boy I remembered. "Ashley's grandmother spent the entire reception asking where you were. She couldn't understand why the groom's mother wasn't present. Every time someone asked, I had to try to explain, and every explanation made me sound more ridiculous." "So, you're here because you were embarrassed?" "I'm here because I realized that the person I was embarrassed of wasn't you. It was me. I was embarrassed of who I'd become, of the choices I'd made, of the way I'd treated the person who loved me most." The conversation continued for 2 hours, with Kevin expressing what sounded like genuine remorse for his behavior and genuine interest in rebuilding our relationship. He talked about wanting to understand Thompson and Associates, about learning from Frank and the other experienced employees, about proving himself worthy of Richard's legacy. "I know I can't undo what I did," he said as the evening wound down. "And I know that just saying I'm sorry isn't enough. But I want to try to earn back your trust, your respect, and eventually, maybe, my place in this family." "Kevin," I said carefully, "if you're serious about working at Thompson and Associates, it can't be because you want your inheritance back. It has to be because you genuinely want to learn and contribute." "I understand. Do you? Because this isn't a temporary inconvenience you need to endure to get what you want. This is about fundamentally changing who you are and how you approach relationships." "I know, and I want to change. I want to be the kind of man Dad would be proud of, the kind of son you deserve." 3 days later, Kevin started work at Thompson and Associates as a junior project assistant, the same position Richard had created for summer interns and new graduates. Frank assigned him to work directly with the field crews, learning construction from the ground up, understanding the physical reality of building the homes and commercial properties that had made the company successful. I watched from a distance as Kevin adapted to work that was harder than anything he'd ever done, both physically and psychologically. He was used to air-conditioned offices and client meetings, not job sites and manual labor. He was used to being deferred to because of his education and connections, not having to prove himself through competence and reliability. Some days went better than others. Frank reported that Kevin was making an effort, showing up on time, following instructions, treating the experienced workers with respect rather than condescension. But there were also days when his frustration showed, when the gap between his expectations and reality became obvious, when he seemed to be going through the motions rather than genuinely engaging with the work. December brought the first real test of Kevin's commitment. A major project fell behind schedule due to weather delays and permit complications, requiring the entire team to work overtime through the holidays to meet the client's deadline. Kevin would have to choose between the Christmas vacation he and Ashley had planned in Cabo and his responsibilities to the company and his co-workers. He chose to stay and work. For 2 weeks, he put in 12-hour days alongside crews who had initially been skeptical of the boss's son, but gradually began to accept him as a legitimate team member. The work was hard, dirty, and unglamorous, exactly the kind of labor Kevin had spent his entire adult life avoiding, but he did it. And according to Frank, he did it without complaint, without asking for special treatment, without reminding anyone that he was supposed to inherit part of the company someday. "He's starting to get it," Frank told me after the project was completed, successfully. Starting to understand that this isn't just about money or inheritance. It's about being part of something bigger than yourself. Christmas morning arrived with a surprise. Kevin and Ashley appeared at my door carrying a small, wrapped package and wearing expressions of nervous hope. It was our first interaction as a family since the wedding, our first holiday together since Richard's death, our first attempt at rebuilding something from the wreckage of our previous relationship. "We brought you something," Kevin said simply, handing me the gift. Inside was a framed photograph of Richard taken at a Thompson & Associates job site, smiling proudly beside a house the company had built for a young family. I recognized the photo immediately. It had been taken just months before his cancer diagnosis, capturing him in his element, doing the work he loved. "I found it in Dad's office files," Kevin said. "I thought you should have it. To remember what he built, what he stood for, what he wanted the company to represent." The gift was simple but meaningful, chosen with care rather than expense. It represented something I hadn't seen from Kevin in years: thoughtfulness, consideration for my feelings, awareness of what might actually matter to me. We spent Christmas Day together quietly, sharing stories about Richard, talking about the company, discussing Kevin's progress and challenges in his new role. Ashley was different too, less focused on image and more genuinely engaged with family conversation. The wedding disaster seemed to have taught them both something about the difference between what looked good and what actually mattered. As winter turned to spring, Kevin's transformation continued slowly but consistently. He learned to operate equipment, to read blueprints, to coordinate with subcontractors, to solve the practical problems that arose daily in construction work. More importantly, he learned to work as part of a team, to respect the expertise of the people who hadn't gone to business school but understood how to build things that lasted. Frank began giving him more responsibility, including him in client meetings, allowing him to contribute to project planning, trusting him with decisions that could affect both budgets and timelines. Kevin rose to meet each challenge, not always successfully, but always with genuine effort. "He's becoming someone Richard would recognize," Frank told me after Kevin had been with the company for 8 months. "Still has a long way to go, but he's on the right path." The first anniversary of Richard's death arrived with a gravity I hadn't expected. Kevin asked if he could visit Richard's grave with me, something he hadn't done since the funeral. We drove to the cemetery together in comfortable silence, both lost in our own thoughts about loss and healing and the complicated process of rebuilding trust. At Richard's graveside, Kevin spoke quietly about what he'd learned in his months at Thompson & Associates, about the respect he'd gained for his father's work, about his regret for not appreciating it while Richard was alive to see it. "I wish I could tell him I finally understand," Kevin said, his voice thick with emotion, "that I get what he was trying to teach me, what he and Mom built together, why it mattered so much to him. He knows," I said simply, "and he'd be proud of the work you're doing to honor it." Standing there beside Richard's grave, with Kevin, genuinely grieving not just his father's death but his own failures to appreciate him while he lived, I felt something shift in my own heart. Not forgiveness exactly, because some wounds take longer to heal than others, but hope. Hope that family relationships could be rebuilt, that people could genuinely change, that legacy was something that could be earned as well as inherited. As we approached the 2-year mark of Kevin's employment at Thompson & Associates, Patricia raised the question of whether to restore his inheritance according to the terms we'd originally established. Kevin had met the basic requirements, working steadily and learning the business, demonstrating commitment to his father's legacy. But I found myself less interested in the mechanical fulfillment of conditions than in the more fundamental question of whether Kevin had genuinely changed, whether the man he was becoming was someone Richard would want to inherit the family legacy. The answer, I realized, wasn't for me to determine alone. It needed to come from the people who'd worked alongside Kevin, who'd seen his character tested under pressure, who'd witnessed whether his transformation was genuine or just an elaborate performance designed to reclaim his inheritance. So I asked them. Frank, Linda Carter, the foremen and project managers and skilled tradespeople who'd worked with Kevin daily for nearly 2 years. Their answers were consistent and convincing. Kevin had earned their respect through competence and character, not through family connections or manipulation. "He's become someone we'd trust with the company's future," Frank said simply. "Someone who understands what your husband built and wants to preserve it." On a warm afternoon in late spring, I called Kevin into my office at Thompson & Associates. He entered with the easy confidence of someone who belonged there, who'd earned his place through work rather than birthright, who understood the business from the foundation up. "Kevin," I said, "Patricia tells me you've fulfilled the conditions for restoring your inheritance." He nodded quietly, but his expression remained serious rather than triumphant. "I hope so. But honestly, Mom, that's not why I've been doing this work." "Why have you been doing it?" "Because I wanted to understand what Dad built. Because I wanted to earn back your respect. Because I wanted to become someone worth inheriting what you and Dad created together." "And have you become someone worth inheriting it?" Kevin considered the question carefully before answering. "I think I'm becoming that person. I don't think I'm there yet, but I'm working toward it every day." His humility, his continued commitment to growth rather than entitlement, convinced me in ways that arrogance or demands never could have. "Then it's time we made this official," I said, sliding a legal document across the desk. "Welcome back to the family inheritance, Kevin. You've earned it." Later that evening, as I sat in the garden Richard and I had planted together, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this point. Kevin's transformation hadn't been quick or easy, and there were still days when I wondered if it was completely genuine. But transformation is rarely a destination. It's usually an ongoing process of choosing to be better than you were yesterday. The phone rang, and Kevin's name appeared on the screen. These days, his calls came regularly, not because he needed something, but because he wanted to check on me, to share news about work, to maintain the kind of relationship family members actually maintain with each other. "Mom?" His voice carried genuine warmth. "Ashley and I were wondering if you'd like to come to dinner this weekend. She's making that chicken dish you taught her, and we thought we could plan the next Thompson & Associates community project." The invitation was simple, familial, the kind of normal interaction I'd stopped hoping for years ago. Kevin and Ashley had purchased a modest home in Riverside rather than Manhattan Beach, prioritizing proximity to family and work over prestigious addresses. They were building a life based on realistic means and genuine values rather than expensive ambitions and social climbing. "I'd love to," I said, meaning it completely. As I hung up the phone, I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, devastated by my son's cruelty, heartbroken by his rejection, overwhelmed by the prospect of rebuilding my life without Richard. That woman couldn't have imagined that. The worst day of her relationship with Kevin would eventually become the first day of something better. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is the opportunity to face the consequences of their choices. Sometimes love requires saying no, setting boundaries, refusing to enable behavior that hurts both the giver and the receiver. Sometimes, the kindest thing you can do for someone is to stop making excuses for them and start expecting them to be the person they're capable of becoming. Kevin had been given that opportunity, and he'd risen to meet it. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but genuinely and consistently. He'd learned that family relationships require investment, that legacy requires worthiness, that love demands reciprocity. And I'd learned that strength and kindness weren't opposing forces, that setting boundaries was an act of love, that sometimes the best way to save a relationship is to be willing to lose it. The sun set over the garden Richard and I had designed together, casting long shadows across the space where we'd planned for a future that had been cut short by cancer, but extended by the choices our children made in its aftermath. Kevin had chosen to honor his father's memory through work and character, rather than just inheritance and entitlement. It had taken a wedding I wasn't invited to attend, to teach us both what family really meant. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories. Right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.